to the Chamber Leadership Alliance and today's Chamber Leadership Development Program training.
Welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Akriti Rana and I am the Chamber Leadership Alliance Program Manager. I'd like to welcome you all for today's training, and today's topic is understanding and measuring impact during COVID-19 and beyond. And before I introduce you to our expert for the day, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. Just like last time, this session is also being recorded, and the presentation for all the three training series, all the three trainings in this series will be uploaded on the CLA website tomorrow, on July 15th. So please be sure to share the recordings and the presentations of this series with your chamber leadership. Also, please, I encourage you all to use the chat and the Q&A function on the platform so that if you have any questions, our expert will be able to answer them at the end of the session during the Q&A section of the training. Also, thank you everyone for those who filled out the pre and post training survey for June 30th program. Please be sure to fill out the post-training survey for this training as well, which you will all receive in your email after the training. And lastly, and most excited about this announcement is I would like to welcome you all to participate in a post-training discussion session on Zoom. The meeting session will start after this training at 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. And the link for that meeting for this informal discussion will be posted on the chat function very shortly. Now, without wasting any more time, I'd like to introduce to you all our expert, Ms. Ava Knox. Ava, welcome to the program and training again.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here again. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that you can see today's topic of understanding and measuring impact during COVID-19 and beyond. This is our third and final training together. So I would just encourage you to use like Akriti said, use the chat feature with any questions. We'll do a Q&A at the very end, but for a warm-up, just please share in the chat sort of where your chamber is in your strategic planning process. If you are in one, if this is something that you're familiar with, if you've done this before, if you have not, I think it is relevant to measuring impact as part of, usually outcomes get developed during the strategic planning process. So I'm just sort of curious at what place you are in this process. And this is our agenda for today. So we're going to talk about what monitoring and evaluation is, and a little bit about how to create what the monitoring and evaluation process is, which would include your program planning, monitoring and evaluation planning, data collection, and then analysis and reporting. This is sort of the final piece of our grants program chart. And then we'll talk about how to either get started or improve your existing monitoring and evaluation, and then what this looks like right now during a global health crisis and then beyond. I think I'm seeing in the chat, and this was sort of my guess, that everyone is kind of in a reevaluation phase because of the pandemic. And so that's very common. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Before we get too deep into our agenda, I want to talk about what we're not talking about today. We're not going to talk about how to track your data, like certain databases or like CRMs. We're not going to talk about that today. We're not going to talk about how to analyze it with specific examples. We're not going to talk about advanced data analysis. And we're not going to talk about sort of the cultural limitations of different methods for monitoring and evaluation. This is all, we're going to do sort of a broader overview. Those are deeper topics that today is not going to be the focus of, but I encourage you to think about after today's session. And then again, before we begin, this is monitoring and evaluation looks different based on sector and mission. And so it's not always necessary for all of your programs or even at all times for your whole organization, depending on where you are in your development. It could be a good strategic choice if you're just getting started for certain programs that really need some evidence behind it to get funding or during a global health crisis. So I just want to say that before we begin, this might not be the right time for your particular organization or for your particular program that you're thinking about today. So I don't want you to feel overwhelmed with this information. It is really, it's time consuming. And so part of today will be learning about it and to then think strategically about when this is something that you want to incorporate into the work that you're doing. So again, this is our grant program flowchart. We are at the end. We are at the reporting and stewarding relationships phase. We're actually not going to talk about stewarding relationships, but this is monitoring and evaluation is used for reporting. And that is sort of the last piece of the grant program cycle. So we've covered a lot in these last 3 sessions, and this is sort of to wrap it up. Okay, so what is monitoring and evaluation and why is it important? So this is something that we use to assess either projects or programs or your whole organization all together. It's just the process by which we collect data and then analyze that data to provide information to key decision makers, and that could be internal or external. Some bigger organizations have research teams or data teams. Some organizations, the program staff is responsible for this kind of evaluation work, or project directors. And some organizations don't have anyone that does this kind of work exclusively. And so this, hopefully this will, if that is where you're at in your development, then this will be clarifying and who might be the right person on your staff to take on this work, or if you need to move externally. It's kind of the same with grant writing, right? So if you're very new to this, just getting started, this is what we're thinking about this. This is the answer to the question, how do you evaluate your programs, which you'll find on many, many grant applications. Okay, and so why this is important. This is something that is easy to say, we don't have time for this, we don't have resources for this, we're not gonna do it right, so we're not gonna do it at all. And there's definitely truth to that. But I want to talk a little bit about why you should be considering it. And this is from a Forbes article. Just a few key points that I thought were important to share from this article. It's important if you're going to start any project to have a thorough baseline survey of who you're hoping to target, and then to do follow-up to make sure that your programs are hitting the mark. Like, we want to make sure that what we're doing matters. And this monitoring and evaluation is how we do that. Without this baseline and like a thought out plan, you're likely to make too many assumptions. And this could be based on biases or experiences that you have that inform your biases, whether they're personal or cultural, and about how you can serve communities effectively. And so this is a way to sort of mitigate that bias. And then without good data that's talking about, that demonstrates how your efforts impact your mission, it's tough to be strategic and to inspire your team to be accountable to your donors and to sort of steer an effective course for the growth of your organization. So monitoring and evaluation touches a lot of internal and external ideas. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Again, you care about making a difference. You have a mission. We care that our work is successful. That's why we evaluate it. It also helps us get more funding. It has, you could justify the need for greater funding, for continued funding, for new funding, if you can prove that the work you're doing is having an impact and the impact that you want it to have. And it also helps you improve your programs over time. So you can make small changes or bigger changes as you're receiving new information about the effectiveness. The kinds of questions that monitoring and evaluation answers there's a number of questions, but some examples are: how are individuals making use of this program? Is it an in-demand program? Are we reaching the intended population that we designed it for? What is the impact? We talked about that. Like, what is the specific change it's making in either individuals' lives or in the community overall? And then more internal questions. Which program out of the several that we have is a better use of staff time or funding, our time and resources? Where should we be directing it? And why? Why is it working? Why is it not working? If it's not working, if we have the why, then we can fix it or put our time and resources elsewhere. We're going to start with some definitions. Monitoring, so we talked about monitoring evaluation. Monitoring is the collection of the routine data. So this is ongoing. This is the data that measures the progress towards our program objectives. We want to be collecting it on a routine basis. It's used to track the changes in performance over time. So like I said, yes, it must be ongoing and continuous. It helps us make informed decisions. So monitoring looks like counting, tracking, collecting. I think we're all sort of, that's a pretty easy to understand concept. And then evaluation, you're measuring how well that your program activities have met your expected objectives. And then also you're measuring to what extent can these outcomes be attributed to your work, specifically the program that you have, that you've been operating. And so because of that, we have to do data collection at the beginning and the end. We must use controlled groups, and then we must have well-designed studies. And we're going to talk all about that because that is the hardest part. So this is just a visual representation of what I just said. Monitoring, we're looking from the beginning of the program to the end of the program, what has happened. And that's helpful information, but with evaluation, we can look at what would happen without the program, demonstrate that difference. That difference between the without program and with program is what we want to share with funders to get new money, to get more money, what we want to share with stakeholders in our organization, with program participants. This is the proof that there's a reason for what you're doing. So evaluation is really important for making our case in winning grant proposals, and that evaluation can't happen if we're not doing the monitoring. Again, this is kind of a repeat, but monitoring is regular, continual information on status of your implementation, and evaluation is like a one-time snapshot of your achievements, and so they work together. This is a little bit of a review from our last webinar. If you attended, then you will remember, but if not, I will review that goals are big, broad statements. They have a long-term ideal outcome in mind. They're the big picture. And goals serve as the foundation for developing your objectives, which, as I said last time, sometimes a funder might use these terms interchangeably, but we know better. And so we will, it's good to get on the same page, at least internally, about what we mean when we use words. And so goals in this, at least in my recommendation, goals are the broad statements. And then your objectives are the specific statements that indicate how you're going to achieve your goals. And so you will likely have multiple objectives to address one single goal. And again, if you're an experienced grant writer, or if you're pretty deep into your strategic planning process, you likely have these drafted already, but I will encourage you to consider making them SMART goals, SMART objectives, or SMART E, which we talked about last time. This is a review, but we want them to be strategic and measurable, ambitious, realistic, time-bound. And then on top of that, we want them to be inclusive and equitable at this moment in time more than ever, but always. And so this is, again, a review. I'm not going to spend too much time here because we talked about this the last time. This is really important in grant writing, but it's important internal work as well. So I want to dig into some more monitoring and evaluation specific key terms and concepts. So the first one I want to talk about is process objectives. We're going to talk about a few different kinds of objectives. One kind of objective is process objectives. So these are objectives that provide the groundwork or implementation that's necessary to achieve your other objectives. So one example might be that your chamber might adopt a comprehensive plan for job growth in your city. And so in this case, just the adoption of the plan itself is the process objective. And then we're going to have individual or behavioral outcome objectives. So these objectives look at the changing behaviors of individuals and then the result from those changes in behavior. So an example of this might be that this example chamber that I'm using Washington, D.C. Chamber of Commerce, but an imaginary version that I've made up. So they might develop an objective for having an increased number of Washington, D.C. residents starting small businesses. That's a change in behavior of individuals. And then the next objective might be that there are then an increased number of jobs. That's the result of this change in behavior. And then there are community-wide objectives. So this is often the result of behavior change in many people. And so we're more focused on the community level instead of an individual level. And so this same chamber that I am imagining might have an objective of increasing the percentage of the DC workforce being DC residents. And so this would be a community level outcome because it would be the result of behavior change in many people. And these work together. So these aren't mutually exclusive. You can develop objectives in all three categories and they can all be interconnected. So this is something that you'll want to be pretty nuanced about. We're going to get into sort of how to create these and the order in which to create them, but I just want to define a few more key terms before we dive too deep into that. We're going to talk more about everything that I'm saying, but I'm just trying to give you some definitions here. So objectives are also not the same as activities or outputs. And I think this is important, particularly for chambers. You might have a lot of activities. You might know that you're running a lot of programs. You have a lot of initiatives, a lot of projects, but that's not the same as your objective. And it's also not the same as your outputs. So an objectives, right? Again, they're the statements that describe the results. The activities are the actual actions you take. So the events you plan, the interventions you deliver as a part of your program are your actions, but they're not your objectives. Your objectives are not to plan 3 networking events. That's not an objective, those are activities. The objectives, right, are the results that will be achieved as a result of those actions or activities. And then we'll talk about outputs a little bit later too, so I wanted to define that here, but outputs are the products of activities. You're going to get this written down afterwards, so you don't feel like you have to memorize this now. But outputs are tangible evidence of your intervention. So they're not your outcomes, but if your activity is a networking event, then the output might be 100 attendees at your networking event. Again, these aren't your objectives, they're not your outcomes, they're just the things that you do. They're important, but they're not where it ends. So let's use an example. This is, again, DC Chamber of Commerce is real, but these examples I've made up. So let's say that the DC Chamber of Commerce helps address the needs of all businesses in Washington, DC through both resources and advocacy. So that their goal would be to create a competitive market for workers to find secure and good paying jobs. That's the big picture goal. It's broad. One objective, again, you can have many, but one objective is to increase resident employment base to at least 70% of the workforce being DC residents by the end of 2020. I don't know if that's a real objective of theirs. I've made it up. But so this is right, this is specific. This is a SMARTY objective, or at least a SMART objective. To support this objective, the activities could include advocating on behalf of DC businesses with the local government. Other activities might include hosting monthly 3-hour business networking sessions. So again, we want to pick apart the different components of the work you're doing and put some intention behind it. If we're thinking about this in terms of monitoring and evaluation, the monitoring will tell us how well the program is going and what's not working. So it'll tell us how many people are participating in our business networking sessions. It'll tell us how many hours of networking we have provided to the business community. It'll tell us if residents have stopped coming or if an increased number have come. And it'll tell us how many hours of advocacy we have done or how many government officials we have been in front of. That's monitoring. The evaluation will tell us if we're meeting our objectives, which we'll get to how to create them. But so that might be the DC residents' employment rate is increasing, or the local government is adopting pro-business agenda items or policies. So monitoring, evaluation work together, but they are different. One is talking about the specific things that are happening on an ongoing basis, and the other is talking about the achievement. This is another example. I'm not going to go through this because we have a lot of slides today, but I wanted you to have multiple examples when you review the slides later. Okay, so the monitoring and evaluation process, let's dig into how to do it. So it is a 4-part process in my head. So we start with program planning, and then we have our monitoring and evaluation planning, and then we collect our data, and then we analyze and report on it. So before we dig into monitoring and evaluation planning, we have to talk about how to create programs, effective programs with strong goals and objectives. So understanding program design, I want to zoom out just a little bit here to talk about some concepts that might be review for those of you that are very experienced, but I just want to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page. So this is just a basic understanding of program design. So a typical nonprofit organizational structure is built around programs designed to achieve your organization's mission. This includes chambers also. So this structure is based on community needs, and these needs are identified by research, whether that's formal or informal, and these needs are developed during the strategic planning process, part of why I asked you before, where you're at in that process. So nonprofits, including chambers, often define their programs during strategic planning. Because chambers sort of live in this space in both worlds of nonprofit and for-profit, I just want to talk about the distinction pretty broadly. So the for-profit business model is a direct feedback loop, right? You provide a good or service to the customer, and then capture the value of that good or service from the customer. So if we provide something valuable, we attract more customers, cover our full costs. It's just a direct feedback loop. But the nonprofit structure is indirect. So we're providing services to participants or target population for free, or at least a lower cost than is required. So we don't capture the value directly from the participants. We ask donors and funders and members to support our work on behalf of our participants or our target population. And so those donors and funders decide to give based on how we describe our program, not necessarily out of their own direct experience. And something that I think is important to note about this is that this is intentional. So funders and individual donors are fundamental in the sector. It's not just that we need donors, but the nonprofit sector was designed to need them. It's not a failure of your chamber or of nonprofits generally. It's literally built in to the structure. So this business model requires you to be providing more value to your participants than they can afford to pay. It requires philanthropy. Okay, and this is a reminder, we talked about this on our first webinar, but different stakeholders, different funders have different types of impacts that they're looking for. Public government funders have specific objectives that are shaped by politics and policy. Private foundations, they give very widely based on their personal passion or their values of their family. And then corporate funders give to advance their business objectives. So they're looking, each of these, you might be writing grants to all 3 of these types of funders, but they're all looking for different kinds of impact. And that's important when you're in the process of figuring out what kind of impact you're going to measure. So part of program planning is theory of change and logic models. And this can be its own webinar in itself, talking about theory of change and logic models. But I do think it's important to touch on. So I want to talk a little bit about what the difference is, why it's important. And then I have some slides in here about how to do your own theory of change and logic model planning process. I'm not going to go through that with you today, but I wanted you to have that information in case you haven't gotten to this part in your strategic planning. So those will be in the slides, but we're not going to talk about step-by-step how to create them, but we're going to talk a little bit broadly what they are. So the theory of change is the description of how and why a desired change is expected to happen. And a logic model is a detailed description of your program, showing how each of your activities lead to immediate outputs and how those outputs lead to outcomes and long-term goals. We'll dive into exactly what that might mean. So your theory of change is again, it's like a goal. It's the big picture. It's messy or it's complex. How does the change happen? Can be really direct or really indirect, depending on what kind of change you're talking about. But your logic model should be specific. It should be more organized and clear. It's the pathway that your project, your program, your organization deals with this. So another way to think about it is that a logic model answers questions that start with what. A logic model answers, what do you have? What do you do? What do you achieve? What is the change? But the theory of change is the underlying question of how. How do all the things that you have and what you do lead to change? How does that change happen? And so a theory of change, we're going to start with that and then go to logic models. A theory of change can be represented in either a visual diagram or as a narrative or sort of a combination of both. I'm going to show you some examples. And it focuses on two things. It's causal links and assumptions. And again, at the beginning, we talked about wanting to avoid too many assumptions, but some assumptions are key. So the causal link, that's the connection between the outputs and the outcomes. So this is like if-then logic. If this intervention occurs successfully, then it leads to this desired result. We'll work through that framework in more detail. The assumption is behind the logic, there's a set of beliefs or assumptions that support these expectations about how change will occur. So these are important because context might influence whether your outcomes are achieved. You're experts in the field, you're experts in the populations that you're serving. So if your assumptions can be backed up by research, data, previous evaluations, then your theory of change is stronger. But as we talked about in our last session, that you might be working with historically overlooked populations in terms of research. And so we might have to rely on more assumptions to start our evaluation process, and that's okay. So these are some examples. This is one is silly, but I'm going to get into real ones after this. But this is just sort of to understand the framework. So this is a sample theory of change for solving the problem of I'm always late to work. How to change from I'm always late to work to I arrive to work on time. That's the change that we want to see happen. And again, theories of change can be messy. There's multiple thought processes here. So if the problem is, if we start with the root causes of the problem, which is that I stay up too late watching Netflix, I can't fall asleep because I've been drinking coffee all day. Both of those things lead to me going to bed late. If I go to bed late, then I wake up late. If I can't decide what to wear in the morning and I wake up late, then I leave my house late. If I leave my house late, I hit traffic and then I'm late to work. And so this is the column on the right is going to talk about this is our theory of change. So this is if-then logic. If we set a bedtime, stop watching Netflix, and if we reduce our daily coffee intake, then we will go to bed earlier. If we go to bed earlier, we'll wake up earlier. If we prepare an outfit the night before and wake up earlier, then we will leave the house earlier. If we leave the house earlier, we can take a different route to work and avoid traffic. And then if we take a different route to work, then we will get to work on time. This is a silly example, but it kind of shows you that just like outside of work, how to think through what like a theory of change can look like. This is our theory that if these things happen, then change happens. Let's get into something that's more concrete. This is from Animal Charity Evaluators, just found this online. So they don't talk about, this doesn't show exactly what the interventions are, but we have animal charity. They have all of these interventions. They have 7 different interventions, which lead to a few different things. And some of them, you can see arrows go to the same place. But all of their interventions, if they happen, then they influence public opinion, they build capacity, they influence the industry, they build alliances, and they influence policy and law. And if all of those changes happen, then there is change for animals, which is what they're trying to see. So this is like one visual representation of what your theory of change could look like. Again, it can be big and messy because change is not neat and organized. This is an example talking about employee support. So if this Workforce Innovation Network their program has an increased intermediary role, Then they would have the ability to convene and support employers. They would broker and provide services. They could improve education and training. They could conduct research and development and help govern. If all of those things could happen, then they would have all these benefits for low-income individuals. And if all of these benefits for low-income individuals could happen, then low-income people find jobs and employers get a skilled workforce. That is their theory of change, that their increased intermediary role would lead to the change, which is low-income people find jobs and employers get skilled workforce. And this is how they see that change happening. This is another example. I just wanted to include a bunch so that when you review the slides later, you have some examples. I'm not going to talk about how to create your theory of change, but I'm just going to share that these slides are here. So there's two different ways to create it. There's the idea of backwards mapping, which is identifying the long-term goals and then working backwards. Or there's forward mapping, which is sort of if then or so that thinking. So this starts with your activities and then narrows it down more and more specifically to your outcomes and then to your goal. These are just some examples for you. This is for you to work through later. I wish we had time to talk about it, but we have a lot to cover. So I just wanted to let you know that's all there. Logic models are related. So a logic model demonstrates the key relationship among the resources you have, the activities you plan, and the changes you hope to achieve. That's why we started with our theory of change, because that's a key component of our logic model. So that framework is from, this framework right here is from the Kellogg Foundation. So this is sort of what, answering these questions is how you think through a logic model. You think we use these resources that we already have to implement these activities, to produce these outputs, so that people will change in these ways, which we've identified in our theory of change, which will lead to these outcomes, which will lead to this impact, big picture. So we're going to talk more about this. So this is an example, a template of what a logic model could look like. The resources are what you have. Those are your inputs. This is your time, your money, your reputation, your staff, your volunteer, your board, your expertise, anything that you already have. The activities are what you do. So these are the elements of your program and the evidence that the program and activities are happening. And then right there in the middle, you have your theory of change. So this is your explanation of how and why your activities lead to outcomes, which is why that part was messy, but this part is thought through. And then so based on, we take our resources and activities, put it through our theory of change, and that's what leads to our outcomes, our short-term changes, our midterm changes, and our long-term changes. All of these slides are going to be shared with you, so you'll be able to sort of take this and use it as a template. But another way we might think about this is that your resources and your activities, that's the monitoring part that we were talking about earlier. And then the change part, that's the evaluation. That's how we can fit this into it. Monitoring tells us is just the collection of the information, and then the evaluation are the achievements. So there's a few different reasons why you would use a logic model. Like I said before, this is like an internal and external process. So you might use a logic model during your planning to clarify your program strategy. Sometimes you have been your organization maybe has been running programs for so long that you don't really have clarity about the strategy anymore. You just do them. It'll help you identify appropriate outcomes, your targets for your outcomes, set priorities for allocating your resources, and identify maybe partnerships that you might need to have. You also might use a logic model during stakeholder orientation, maybe for board members, for new staff, to explain overall how the program works, and to show how different people work together and define what each partner does. If you're showing this to a potential new partner, and to indicate how you would know if the program is working or is not working. You might use your logic model during evaluation to document your accomplishments or to sort of organize the evidence about the program, to identify differences between the ideal program and then what's really happening, how it's actually operating. And you might use your logic model to determine which concepts you are going to measure and which ones you are not going to measure. Like I said in the beginning, monitoring and evaluation work is not appropriate at all times for all programs. You might not have the resources, or it might not be the best time, or it might not be, it might not help serve your needs. So a logic model could help you determine what you should be measuring and what you can't measure. And then in the case that is most interesting to me is you might use it during your advocacy and your fundraising. So this justifies why your program will work and how a funder's resource investment will be used. If you can demonstrate this really clearly, then a funder will see you as a good steward of their investment, of their resources. So again, creating a logic model, same as creating a theory of change, you can do it forwards or backwards. Moving forwards from your activities. So it explores the rationale for activities that are proposed or currently underway. It's driven by but why or if then thinking, same as before, or reverse logic. So you can talk about the effect that you want to have and then move backwards. So you know that this is your value, or this is the change that you and your colleagues want to see occur. And then you work backwards asking, but how, but how, but how, and get to the activities. So let's do some examples of logic models. See, again, this is when we looked at the examples of theory of change, you saw that they were more intricate and they could be messier and there were different lines going different places. Your logic model, you want to be straightforward. So this example of a logic model for College Matters, they have their inputs. Those are their students, their mentors, their curriculum, their center, their building, their program. That's all their inputs. They have these things. Their activities, individual academic plans, individualized tutoring, workshops. Their outputs, they're the 100 youth and parents that are participating in the workshops, that are participating in the SAT prep classes, and the number of hours of individualized academic tutoring the number of students receive. Those are all the things that happen. That's proof that your activities occurred. And then it can't stop there. A lot of organizations, that's as far as they get. They say, we have these things, we do these things, and they happened, and we can prove that they happened, but that's not good enough. We need to talk about the outcomes now. So in this case, all of these things led to raising the GPA of their participants by 15% over the course of the year, 95 understanding the steps needed to apply to college and obtain financial aid. And those outcomes have led to the big impact, which is there's increased college application rate and increased acceptance and attendance rate. So this is the big picture thinking that you might be working towards. You might have your activities, and you need to work towards your big picture impact. This is just another example. Logic models can they don't have to look one particular way, but the idea is that they're orderly. The lines are a little bit more direct. So in this case, it's more of a pyramid. The ultimate outcomes at the top, which is that Canadian businesses and consumers prosper in a competitive and innovative marketplace. And then so you look down at the bottom, we have their inputs, which are not spelled out here. Their activities, they have a lot of different types of activities. The outputs, the intermediate outcomes, increased engagement with their partners, increased business awareness, policymakers increasingly considering competition when making decisions, increased consumer awareness of deceptive marketing, and then, those are immediate outcomes. Intermediate outcomes are then the markets are competitive, efficient, and innovative. Businesses are compliant with Canada's laws. Consumers are making informed choices, which all leads to, again, that ultimate outcome. This is another way it could look. Again, there's no right way for it to look. But this just talks about this is for young girls who are involved in a juvenile justice system. And it talks specifically about, this includes a little note about their need because it's specific and important to note. Again, their inputs, their activities, their outputs, and then their outcomes, which they have defined as short, intermediate, and long. They have defined those by number of weeks. That might be relevant for your work, or it might be appropriate to keep it more vague. Okay, so that was program planning. That is, again, we could do a whole webinar on just program planning, but we don't have time for that today. So that is how you design thoughtful programs. And now we're going to talk about how you plan to monitor and evaluate them. So why would you create a monitoring and evaluation plan? It guides the implementation of your activities in a standardized and coordinated way. It also documents the consensus and provides transparency, and it provides accountability. And I think something that's important for chambers or nonprofits generally is that it preserves institutional memory. So your plan might typically include the well-defined concepts and how you're going to measure them, the schedule at which you're monitoring these activities, a list of data sources that you're going to be using, cost estimates for these activities, a list of partnerships and collaborations if that's relevant, and then finally a plan for this dissemination and utilization of the information gained. What are you going to do once you've evaluated your programs? Again, that's not good enough either. What? Does this mean that you are going to share this information with your funders? Are you going to share it with your internal stakeholders? Are you going to have a program meeting to adjust your programs as a result of the feedback? You need to know in advance what you're going to do with that information. This is a bit of a review, but your data sources can be quantitative, qualitative, or anecdotal. So quantitative data is numeric. It typically allows for summarizing characteristics across groups. The most common method for this is a survey. Qualitative data can be used to complement your quantitative data. So this can describe observations. It can typically go deeper. So this might be interviews, open-ended questions, focus groups. This might not necessarily be numeric, but it is still absolutely appropriate. And then anecdotal evidence this is important for grants. This is like your testimonials, your quotes from participants. It's a little bit, it's different than an interview or a focus group because it's kind of one-off. This might be collected by staff who are monitoring the program. It's not the same though as qualitative data. They seem related, but one is intentionally tracked and one is sort of, like I said, one-off observations. And the anecdotal evidence, while it's important for grant writing, it might warm up the story of your information. It's not the type of data you should be using for decision-making. Because like we said before, there's too much room for bias and assumptions. Okay, so indicators are like one of the most critical steps in designing your monitoring evaluation plan. So these are the markers that measure your program. So they show how close your program is to its desired path and outcomes. They provide benchmarks for demonstrating the achievements, and the choice of indicators will inform the rest of your plan. So how you're going to evaluate, what methods you're going to use to evaluate and analyze and report depends on the type of indicators that you choose. And so typically we think about three different kinds of indicators: input, process, and outcome. So an input indicator measures the contributions necessary to enable the program to be implemented. So your funding, your staff, your partners, your infrastructure. So again, it's a lot like logic model. And then your process indicators measure the program's activities and outputs. So that together they sort of indicate whether the program is being implemented as planned. Is it going according to the plan? Are the steps happening? And then your outcome indicators measure whether the program is achieving the expected changes. And so this should be measured at the beginning and end of the program to see the change, right? That's like we talked about at the beginning. So we want a baseline, and then we want at the end of your intervention. And so an indicator is a variable. So the value changes from the beginning to the end after the activities have been implemented. It's also a measurement. It measures the value of change in meaningful units. So this can be expressed as a percentage or a number. And indicators also focus on a single aspect of a program or project. So this can be an input, an output, or an overarching objective, but it's at least narrowly defined in a way that captures just one aspect as precisely as possible. A few different factors are going to affect the indicators you choose. The availability of data and the ease of collecting new data. This is something we talked about in our last one. Like, there might not be data readily available for the populations that you serve. You also might not have time allocated to data collection. You might not have financial resources or human resources dedicated to monitoring and evaluation yet. And there might also be donor requirements. There might be specific things that your donor has asked for. Remember, we talked about the public, private, and corporate funders are looking for different types of impact. Sometimes a funder, when they award you a grant, might indicate exactly how they want you to measure something. So that can all influence the indicators that you end up choosing. You should consider using existing data sources if possible. So if is already like information in the US Census, there's already existing surveys or surveillance happening, start there. But if that's not available, then factor in that you are going to need to collect indicators before. And so that just is something you're going to have to plan for. Let's do an example. College Matters. So participation, the objective here for participation in College Matters individualized tutoring program will increase students' GPAs by 15% over the course of the academic year. This was our SMART objective. It's clear. Our input indicators are the number of students recruited and the number of tutors recruited. These are things that we're going to track. Our process indicators are the number of students who received individualized tutoring plans, the number of students participating in tutoring at 6 months, that's our interval, and the average attendance rate in individualized tutoring, and the total hours of tutoring students receive. And then our outcome indicators are their GPAs in core subjects specifically, and their 6 weeks grades or number of students failing a class. Those would be outcome indicators. So that's one example. Another examples of indicators, if the outcome we're looking for this organization is long-term employment at a livable wage for domestic violence survivors, then the indicator might be employment rate. Pretty straightforward. The target population are the program graduates. The baseline are that 40% of the program's attendees are unemployed and 53% are earning minimum wage. And so the threshold is 90% of the graduates remain in the job at least 6 months and earn at least $12 per hour. Okay, so common issues with indicators are that they're not linked to your program activities, that they might be focusing on your outputs instead of your outcomes, that they're unclear, you have too many indicators, or they lack like a data source. Sorry, let me go back. So again, this is something like I said a few different times, that you want to make sure that what you're monitoring and evaluating is linked to the work that you're doing, but doesn't just stop with your activities. We've got to push a little bit deeper, and that's part of that strategic planning process. Okay, so we're not going to go too deep into types of instruments, but the instrument is the data collection tool. So this is maybe a survey or an interview that's designed to measure specific concept. So again, don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. If there are already surveys out there, borrow from those. Use the best tools you can find. You want instruments that are reliable, so you want them to be consistent over time unless change is expected. and you want them to be consistent across observers. So it can't just be an instrument that like your one program director can implement, but it can't be replicated with others. There's bias there. And you want to look for instruments that are valid. So by that, I mean have proven links to outcomes that are of interest to you. Again, these tools, evaluation tools, might be out there already, and they might not. And if they're not, it's going to be a little bit trickier for you, but the first step is to see what's out there. So an instrument tool may be valid for one set of outcomes, but not for another. As we talked about before, you have one big overarching goal, but you might have multiple outcomes. So we need to have clarity around outcomes of interest, what's going to be the most important to focus on. So an example of that is if a classroom observation system includes validity data regarding the prediction of students' academic achievement during the school year, but it may demonstrate no relation to student dropout rates. So academic achievement and student dropout rates, these are different outcomes. If the objective of conducting your observation is to evaluate whether teachers are engaging in behaviors that promote students' learning over the course of the year, this instrument might be well suited for that purpose. But if the objective is to determine whether teachers are enacting behaviors that will prevent dropout, then you're going to need a different observation that has documented links to dropout rates. So again, we might need multiple instruments, multiple tools, multiple systems, or we might just need clarity on the one that is the most important. If we can only do one, what is the most important? Okay, so that's program planning and monitoring and evaluation planning. I know that's a lot of information. If you have questions now regarding those two topics, please include them in the chat. I'm not going to be able to address them now, but I can address them at the end of the webinar. We'll have time for questions and answers. So while they're still fresh in your head, if you have questions about how to plan your programs or how to plan your monitoring and evaluation process, you can send them to the chat or using the Q&A feature, and we will, like I said, we will address them. Okay. So now let's talk about data collection. So this is the systematic approach to gathering and measuring information from a variety of sources. And so good data collection ensures high quality data. And so a data source is where your information comes through. So an example of a data source could be a survey. It could be staff information, interview data, official government documents, administrative records. Your monitoring and evaluation plan will include information about your data collection plan for each source. So the timing and frequency of the collection, the person or agency responsible for the collection, the information needed for the indicators, and any additional information that will be obtained from the source. This is a big process. I want to just stop and name that this is not easy. This is thorough. I'm asking you to be really thorough. You've probably not, there is likely that many of you have not been this thorough about this process before, but it's so important because, like I said, there's then institutional transparency about it. So as you pass it from person to person at your organization, it is clear, and we're all on the same page with external and internal stakeholders about what we're doing. Okay, so here's another example, this College Matters example that we've been using. So if we collect daily attendance, sorry, let me move this. Okay, if we collect daily attendance at tutoring and put that into an Excel spreadsheet, once a month we compile the attendance records to track the students' attendance. We flag students that have missed 2 or more sessions in the month or follow-up. So that's like using Excel. We ask students to share quarterly report cards and track their grades in each subject. Our program manager is responsible for that collection. This information is needed for the indicators. The information needed for the indicators includes a list of all participating tutors and students, their grade, tutor's name. We track change. We want pre-intervention data. So we collect the student GPAs from last year. We clearly define our terms. We might say that to be counted as having attended, that they have to have attended at least 1 hour of tutoring. We also conduct feedback interviews with tutors twice a year. This is really specific, right? Because otherwise things are open to interpretation, or we're going to get halfway through our program and realize that we're not tracking the specific information that we told the funder we were going to be tracking, and we won't be able to fill out our report, or we're going to be scrambling when it comes time to report on the grant. So we want to be clear about what we're tracking, what we mean, like I said, like clearly define your terms. If you're saying, did someone attend something, does that mean that they walked through the door? Did they stay for at least an hour? What does that mean to you internally? That's just an internal decision you're going to have to make, but make sure that everyone's on the same page about it. If you need your baseline data to track change, are you doing that before your programs start? All of these things, it's really important to think through so that you're not scrambling at the last minute. And then finally, analysis and reporting. So if you're collecting the data, then you can analyze it and report on it. So most organizations report on data annually, maybe at the conclusion of the program, if it's not an annual program. And many produce like a single report per program, which is then provided to the funders or other stakeholders. So reporting should discuss your program fidelity. So how closely you were able to implement what you said you would plan to implement. It addresses the impact of the program, including change over the time, and correlation and causality. And last, it discusses, at least internally, areas of improvement, right? So this is all from the beginning of the webinar. We talked about why we do it. Here it all is. We need it for external reporting, and we need it for internal improvement. So how do you get started, and how do you improve your monitoring evaluation if you're already in it? There's 4 different options that we recommend. And so this is sort of listed in increasing effort and expertise required. So the first option is to select an evidence-based program model that includes recommended monitoring evaluation processes and instruments. So like, what federal agency or university or association of practitioners, what exists in your issue area that you can just use an existing evidence-based program model? Or if you're going to implement your own organizational programs, so that's the program model. This is a program that exists and we're going to implement it as an organization. Or you implement your own programs that you've designed, but you select an existing monitoring and evaluation process and instrument. So we're going to do the planning internally, but then we're going to do research outside to see what already exists that can fit with the program that we've designed. And those are both would be tracked internally after doing your own research. Or you can partner with a local researcher, a local university or department who can help guide your monitoring evaluation. This is seen really frequently. This is something you can ask for in the grants that you write. You can ask for, you can include in your budget line items for an external evaluation consultant. Or you develop your own program design and your own processes and instruments, and you do it all from scratch if you have all of this expertise and effort. So you're either looking for existing models, or you're making it internally, or you're reaching out externally to like contract someone to help you with it. Here are just some examples of online listings of just different kinds of evidence-based programs. Just as an example that there's just a lot, don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of work out there being done. This will be shared with you at the end. There are many assessment tools out there. So you should just have a clear sense of what you want to measure, and that's part of that strategic planning process. And then you search for tools that are considered valid for that issue area. And so you can talk to experts in the field, again, ask academics or researchers, and you can either, like I said, pay them to do the process for you, or you can just sort of talk to them, have informational interviews, and get a sense of what existing validated assessment tools are out there. If you already have a monitoring and evaluation process, review it with the following things in mind. Make sure that you have sound strategy. So these are some recommendations from salesforce.org. The first step to a strong bottom line is defining a sound theory of change and logic model along with SMART indicators. I added SMART-E, that will provide an objective sense of failure or success, right? So this is just making sure that everything, like that your strategy is thought through. So maybe you have a monitoring and evaluation plan in place, but you haven't really thought through your theory of change. Or maybe your logic model, maybe you've done a logic model as a one-off for a grant requirement, but you haven't done it for the programs that matter most. Do you have the appropriate tools and methods? You already have some tools and methods. Are they the appropriate ones? Are they suitable, consistent instruments for collecting data on your defined outputs and outcomes? And so when you're measuring the effects, you need to use appropriate methods that minimize selection and information bias and suit the level of evidence you seek to generate. Again, are these externally validated? Is this replicable? Or does it live just in the head of one staff member at your organization, in which case there's going to be a lot of information selection bias, no matter who you are. Do you have a strong system? So once your tools are developed and standardized, do you have a strong process and platform to manage the day-to-day data flow and to analyze the results? Maybe you have an existing tool, maybe your strategy is in place, maybe you have a good method for evaluating, but do you have a system to make sure this is something you can do on a day-to-day basis? And then do you have sufficient capacity? Do you have the right people with the right skills, with enough time to do the work? Likely you don't, likely you don't have enough time, right? So you need to be able to collect, capture, manage, analyze, and utilize the data effectively. So maybe you have all of the three things above, but you don't have time to actually like take the data and then inform your program decisions. So how can we create the capacity how can we give someone a little bit more capacity so that they can properly manage the data, analyze it, and then utilize it effectively so that your programs can improve over time? Okay. A few tips. Anything is better than nothing. So you can start small. You can just try this out with one area, one program, one project, and see how it goes. You can consider interns or college students to support your research efforts, your evaluation efforts. Don't try to collect more data than you need. This is like a common mistake where you want to, once you start to think about your evaluation process, you might go over the top with it and try to evaluate everything. That's not my recommendation here. Like I said, I want you to be strategic about what's going to be most important to your external, internal stakeholders. And consider pursuing capacity building grants. I know that's something we've talked about before, and that's not always realistic, but if you have a few ways to do that, finding capacity building grants so that you can hire a consultant to do the monitoring evaluation plan for you. You can also, if you have renewed a funder that gives annually, you can consider incorporating a one-time additional request. Now more than ever, considering the pandemic, we need to evaluate the effectiveness of our programs and make some tough decisions. And so we're asking for an additional $10,000 this year to do this one particular thing. That's one way you could go about it as well. Okay, and specifically speaking to COVID-19, why would you evaluate during a crisis? Well, there are a few answers. To adapt services as you go, to keep your staff connected to the bigger picture. Sometimes, especially now that we're all remote, if that's new to your organization, it might be sort of your internal stakeholders might need a little bit more connection to the why of why we do the work we do. To inform your future services post COVID-19. So what's going to stay and what's going to go in the future. Let's evaluate now so that we can make a more streamlined plan. And because we're all in this together, so you can share learning with others in the field. Maybe that's funders, but maybe it's peers. So if you're noticing trends that have to do with the new way the world is working during COVID-19 that you think might be interesting to others doing similar work or doing work that supports the work you're doing, then we can share it with them. You use evaluation for quick decision-making. quick decision making is something that I imagine you've done a lot of recently. We've had to change and adapt very quickly. So focus your key questions on what's essential for you to know for rapid decision making right now. And then adapt your data collection. Be honest about what is realistic. So basic data, monitoring data includes data on the people you are or are not reaching and how they're engaging with you. So you might not be able to collect face-to-face data, but maybe you can adapt and do phone interviews, or you can collect online. And then evaluate new ways of working. So if you have uncertainty around your long-term objectives, let's just focus on short-term objectives. Totally fine. This really, really varies funder to funder, but I think some funders are looking for you to have a new innovative program, and they're going to only give their money to something that is a new solution to an existing problem. And some are going to want a proven track record of your organization's success. But I think in both cases, and so that's something that you will learn in your prospecting and cultivation work, like we talked about before, you'll find out what's important to that funder during that work. But in either case, what you want to be proven is the theory of change, right? So maybe this is a new program for you, but we can use evidence to point to why this kind of work works. And so you might not have outcomes for your specific organization, but maybe you found research that backs the type of program that you're running. And so that's why this work is important. And that's why we're looking, that's why we're doing the research, because maybe it might be new work for you, but it might not be like a new concept. And so either way, again, it's funder preference. Generally speaking, there is no generally speaking here. It's totally, some funders love innovation and some love a known quantity, but you want to show that you've thought through the theory of change, and that is solid. If the funder is by invitation only, don't send them a grant proposal. You can absolutely reach out to them with an email or a letter expressing the interest and requesting a meeting to meet, but they're not going to review, and they're not going to keep something on file. So I don't recommend submitting something cold. I do recommend reaching out cold and trying to build a warm relationship so that you can get an invitation to apply for funding. It's up to the funder if they're going to accept grants from a type of organization that's not a 501c3. So that's what we do, why we do our research. There's not like one particular rule. You're eligible to receive grants. It's just, is a funder interested in granting to organizations that are not 501c3? So that's why we do the research. And it might impact the tax break that the funder receives for donating. They might not get the same tax break, but you would still be eligible to receive a grant. It's just, again, it's up to funder preference. I think you need to focus on a program. I think if this is like all super brand new to you, then focus on your most important program, your core program, the one that wins you the most money, or the one maybe that has the most need. And start there. Start small, evaluate one component of this one program, and see how that process goes. But try to do the process from start to beginning with, really, really commit to the process, but in a small way, and see what that was like for your organization and if you can expand on that. So capacity building grants are just, it's a funder, again, it's all funder discretion. I wish I could give you a better answer than that. But all funders have different support strategies. And so some funders like to give general operating support, unrestricted grants, money for you to do what you need to do with them. That can include overhead and salaries. That can also include program expenses. Some funders our general operating. And again, we're seeing a lot of that during the pandemic, that most funders that were more restricted are now less restricted. Some funders like to give program-specific support. You can't support your operations, but we will give money for your particular program. And then there are a number of different ways funders give support, but one of which is capacity building. So those are often one-time grants, but not always, and it's at the funder's discretion if they like to give you money for things like equipment or staff development or contractors, that sort of thing. And so it's just a matter of making that one-time request and demonstrating why now more than ever there is a need in your organization for this added capacity. And so in that case, you could demonstrate how, if you were going to ask for capacity support for an evaluation process or an external evaluator, you would ask for money, because demonstrating that you know that you've done the research, that you know what the outcomes are that you're hoping to achieve, but you need support in making sure that you're not that you're hitting the mark and that you're actually achieving those objectives, and that's what you need support with. And if you could demonstrate that, then you could be eligible for much more funding from other funders, and so that you can make the case that that one-time capacity building request will actually allow you to, in the future, get even more money, so their dollars will go even farther. Okay, those are all the questions that I'm seeing now, but I can hang on the line for another few minutes if anything else comes in. Thank you so much to everyone. If you have any questions, again, I'm around for another few minutes, but it was really, really, truly a delight getting to know more about the work that the chambers are doing and to be able to talk to all of you over the last 3 sessions.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Ava, and thank you all again so much for your participation and questions. It was so great to see your enthusiasm, for the training with the questions, and just your general enthusiasm and energy. Quick reminder, please fill out the post-training survey for today's training, which you will all receive in your email. Also, the presentations of all 3 trainings from this series will be posted on the Chamber Leadership website. So please, come back and visit us at www.chamberleadershipalliance.com. And we look forward to seeing you in our next training on leadership and chamber governance. And again, as Ava mentioned, please, we invite you to join us for a 30-minute informal discussion post, our training series, just to get to know what you liked, what you didn't like, and just to talk. So thank you so much, Ava, again, for your time. And everyone, we hope to see you in the meeting room in about 5 minutes. Thank you.